Hey, all six of you here. Angela, how are you? Danny, how do you do it? Uh, Kittery, we had a nice day today, didn't we? Buddy and I went snowshoeing and got totally stuck in a thicket. I am so tired, but it was lovely to be out. We haven't been able to we've had so little snow for years. We haven't been able to snowshoe in at least a couple of years. So that was really nice. Texas, Oklahoma City with chickens, South Dakota, one of my favorite states. Do I have a state that's not a favorite state? I don't know. South Dakota is a really cool state. Um, you know, South Dakota had a really vibrant black community in the 1880s, and one of the people who lived there was actually a very good poet. That was a little random. Okay, let me start in here because I'm not going to take a lot of your time today, but I know people are freaking out, and there's a couple of things that really jump out to me in the news. And this is really not today going to be about news, it's going to be about a bigger picture. And one of the things that really jumps out to me is two things. One, that what we are hearing and what is coming at us constantly feels to me like pieces of things. Like it's very hard to know how to react because there's just pieces of things coming at you. And then even to try to piece them into where they're supposed to go in a coherent story is really difficult. And as I've said before, part of that is intentional, that this already has been an extraordinarily opaque administration, that normally when I do politics and when I do history, I can find the source and I can find the numbers. And somebody wrote to me today and said, I keep hearing about these inspectors general who've been fired, and I've heard 15 people and 16 people and 17 people and 18 people. How many is it? And the answer is, I don't know. The most reliable number I have seen is 18, but that is coming from a reporter whose work I really trust. I haven't been able to verify that the way I usually like to do with three different things. So if you're feeling like you just are like a ping pong ball, that is deliberate. It's designed to frustrate you, to get you upset, and to make you tune out. So that's the first thing that jumps out to me. But then there's something else that really hit me today in a way that it seemed worth pointing to. Because what we have seen for the last 2 weeks or so, I always lose track of time, but what we have seen is the Elon Musk, who is the billionaire who put $290 million into Trump's election in 2024, is in charge of this so-called Department of Government Efficiency. And before the election, they talked, and before the inauguration, they talked a lot about how this group would be an advisory body that would advise the government on how to make $2 trillion worth of cuts, which lots of people just rolled their eyes at and said, you can't do that because there's just not enough money in the budget that doesn't cover things that people care deeply about, Republicans as well as Democrats, so you can't do that. And of course, what we ended up with was this group of young engineers that went into the Treasury payment system and simply changed the code and are withholding the monies that are used across the country in a number of different ways. And what is really very clear to me as I'm watching all this happening is that there's a public conversation going on. And that public conversation is one in which most Americans, Republicans and Democrats, don't want Elon Musk accessing their personal information, their private information. That's pretty widely spread. But there is also this other conversation that is a pushback. And I assume you're going to see it in the comments here of people or bots and trolls who are trying to insist that those of us who are unhappy with what Musk is doing are somehow communists or un-American or lefties or lazy or, any of these words that say that we are somehow stopping America from being great. And that conversation, that story is really important. So what I mean by that is that really, since Ronald Reagan, there has been a conversation, largely among Republicans, although to some degree Democrats have picked it up during certain administrations, that the government is bad, that somehow this government that the United States has built and that operates this country of 332 million people is somehow the enemy. It's bad. Because as this story goes, that government is being manipulated by women, by people of color, by Black Americans, by LGBTQ plus Americans, by somehow an other that has taken over that government and is using tax dollars, usually from the story goes from white men, to redistribute into their own pockets. They want goods from the government. They don't deserve them, and that this government is really just a way to take money out of the pockets of good, hardworking white Americans and distribute it to these bad guys. So there is this story that the government is bad, that the government is doing bad things. It's stealing your money. There's a couple of pieces here, though, that are worth thinking about when you hear that story. The first is that the federal government, as part of our gross national product, that's how much we produce every year, has not grown since the 1950s. This idea that we have this out of control government that is just huge and taking over everything just is not borne out by the facts. Now, there was a spike during COVID. So if you look at the charts, and the charts, I've actually linked to these in a number of places, there's a spike for COVID because all of a sudden the government had to do a lot of stuff that it wasn't doing otherwise. But otherwise, the line of government action has been pretty steady since the 1950s, is a percentage of GDP. There is also something really crucial to have your mind around when you think about this story about how the government is bad, is that by getting rid of government regulations and getting rid of taxation, what happened between 1981, when Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, and 2021, when Joe Biden took the oath of office, was that $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1%. So while they kept screaming about how a government that regulated business or taxed the wealthy or any of these things was somehow going to redistribute wealth downward, the opposite was happening. It was redistributing money upward. $50 trillion moved from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. Now, that changed under Joe Biden, but I don't want to talk about him today. Think about the conversation that we're having right now. Then the reason that I'm actually here is somebody said to me that the only reason people are upset about getting rid of U.S. aid, which is the U.S. Agency for International Development, is because of the kickbacks that the people who were participating in U.S. aid were getting. That's a view of the world in which the government is just evil and anybody who is participating in it is somehow on the take. And it's very much a story. It's not a real story. And I'll explain more about that in a second. But let's talk a little bit about USAID. I'm not going to talk about morality at all. And it's important that I'm not going to talk about morality because our government is not founded in morality. And I hope that we are moral people, and certainly the framers and the founders expected we would be moral people. But the founders of the American Declaration of Independence, our set of principles, and the framers of the Constitution explicitly did not want to base a government on morality because they had watched what had happened in Europe, and then later on in the colonies. James Madison watched what was happening in his home of Virginia, where the preachers who were preaching a slightly different flavor of Protestantism were getting thrown in jail. And he said, we can't do this. We can't base a nation on morality for the simple reason that your morality and my morality might be different. And if that's the case, how do we resolve which is the correct version to put into our government? So what the framers of the Constitution did is they said, we're not going to talk about religion. We are not going to have religion involved in our laws, because if we do, we're going to have a really hard time deciding which religion is the one that we should follow. Because if you can affect the way people follow their conscience, you can basically take everything away from them. So we can't do that. And you're seeing that, by the way, right now in things like Trump has given some exemptions to certain religious groups and not others in the cuts that they're trying to make. Do you want that? I mean, is that something that feels like to you it would go in a good direction? I keep thinking of the evangelicals who think that they're going to take over the United States of America and they're going to turn us into some religious organization. And I keep looking at that and thinking of James Madison and saying, literally, James Madison wrote the idea of religious freedom into a set of laws in Virginia because he looked at the fact that Protestants, I mean, he wasn't talking about religions that at the time were considered minority religions or suspect religions. He wasn't thinking about them. He was looking at the Protestants in Virginia fighting over some aspect of doctrine, and the Protestants in the majority throwing the Protestants in the minority into prison. So when people talk nowadays about the idea of making this a religious government, I always sit there and think, you think you can do that because you haven't tried it. Once you start trying to adjudicate who gets to believe what, you're going to end up in real trouble in a hurry. So when I'm going to talk about USAID, I'm not going to talk about the morality of feeding children. I think that's a very good thing. You might disagree. That's okay because it's not part of our governmental system. What USAID does is something very different. USAID uses less than 1% of the United States budget. Everybody thinks we give, huge amounts of money to foreign aid. In fact, we don't. We're lower than most developed countries, or countries with developed economies in the amount of foreign aid we give. But because we are a big, rich country, we give more foreign aid than other countries do. But it's about 1%, a little bit less than right now, less than 1% of our foreign budget, of our total budget. I'm sorry, and it does something called soft power, and what that means is this: if you remember, the idea of a government is to keep the people in it safe. That think about the idea of our defense department. It is to defend us against other countries, but that could be armies, for example, but really in the modern world, what happened after World War II is that countries around the world, led by the United States, thought, we don't want to wait until things get to the point of war. We want to make it possible for people to find ways to get along without going to war. So they do a number of things. They developed the United Nations, for example, which is actually really cool because it's the same nations plus 4 that joined together in an official pact to fight World War II against fascism. That's what United Nations was. But the idea of using money from U.S. taxpayers to help development around the world, and what USAID does is it supports humanitarian goals, it supports long-term economic development, and it supports democracy, pro-democracy efforts. The idea behind that really comes from Eisenhower, from Dwight Eisenhower, who of course was the supreme commander of World War II and was also a brilliant man, and was also president of Colombia, and then he went on to be the president of the United States. And Eisenhower believed fervently, after seeing death camps in, there's a difference between a concentration camp and a death camp, although concentration camps spread disease and lots of people die in them. One concentrates people, one explicitly concentrates them to kill them. And after seeing death camps during World War II, Eisenhower came to believe that if you did not enable people around the world to have a rising standard of living, they were easy prey for religious extremists or political extremists who promised to give them those things. And in a world that had nuclear weapons, that could mean the destruction of the earth. He felt this very strongly. And so Americans had been doing aid around the world in different ways for a while, but he really launched the idea of the government actively funding food programs, for example, and pro-democracy programs, and so on. Now, mind you, Eisenhower didn't get everything right, but the idea of helping people around the world is not somebody saying, well, I just really care about this issue and you should give money to it. It is literally part of the idea that America can defend its interests by making sure wars don't start, by making sure that in war-torn countries, for example, people have food, babies aren't dying, they have fresh water, they have access to safe fuel, that they in some cases can have educations. This is part of what is known as soft power, with the idea that that will really help America's interests by making this happen. And it is for example, in places that have ISIS prisoners, U.S. aid has done things to make sure that they are in camps or imprisoned by their neighbors so that they don't get out. I mean, that's, you know, that ISIS, for example, doesn't get a real foothold in a lot of countries because America can deliver the food and the protection that otherwise ISIS would. So that's the idea behind U.S. aid. Now, that being said, you can disagree with that. And people did from the time Eisenhower talked about it. A lot of people said, let's just bomb them. You know, we just can take care of all of our needs by hunkering down in America. And if a war comes, you know, we got all this weaponry, we can just hurt people. You could side with that. This is a legitimate argument. It's not the way I think, but I'm trying to lay out for you here that the idea of people supporting U.S. aid is about protecting America. The idea that somebody is on the take is, again, part of this story that the government must always be bad, when in fact the people who work for U.S. aid and the people who support it in Congress, which until about 3 weeks ago was most Republicans as well as Democrats, the idea is that this is a way for the American government to defend the American people. And if it happens to feed children, and by the way, the food that U.S. aid uses comes from America. American farmers, about $2 billion a year comes from American farmers to go into the places that U.S. aid provides food. If it happens to help people around the world, that's the whole idea. But somehow, to me, it just really hit me when someone said, oh, their people are just getting kickbacks. And I thought, you know, you really don't understand that you, if you believe that, are adhering to this idea of America, this false story of America, that somehow the government is bad. All the government is part of a very different story. And this is the story that I think Americans need to remember, and that really has been what held us together all the years since the colonists decided in the 1760s that they wanted to throw off monarchy. And that wasn't easy to do, by the way, and it wasn't quick. But there is a different story about America that is the real one, I think, and it's one that too many of us have not been supporting and not been talking about for too long. So here's my stab at it. If you think about the Constitution of the United States, which is the body of laws under which we operate, here's the preamble to the Constitution. It says, we, the people of the United States, not the states, which is what the Articles of Confederation did, but the people, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, that's to come together better than we did under the Articles of Confederation, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, so we're not going to have any more of these mobs like Shays' Rebellion that we had under the Articles of Confederation, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, make sure things are good, the welfare of people, they're going to be faring well, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, one of the ways that I kind of think about the Constitution is in a funny way as sort of crowdsourcing to make sure that individuals can create their own destinies. So what America is it's known as a republic or a democracy. Those are both forms of government in which the people get to determine their rulers. I hear all the time, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And that's like saying, I don't have a dog, I have a golden retriever. Both of those things are forms of government in which the people get to determine the government under which they live. And we are a democracy or a republic that is essentially a way for people to come together and make sure that people are treated equally before the law, so that theoretically we are all equal before the law, that we all have a say in government, which is provided by both the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and that we all have equal access to resources that will enable us to determine our own futures. And by that, that means equal access to education, equal access to housing, equal access to capital, equal access to all the things that will hold the economic playing field level and the social playing field level for all Americans. And that's the job of the United States government, is to hold the playing field level, not to give anybody a leg up. So how did the framers of the Constitution do that? They did it, first of all, by guaranteeing that it was the people's representatives who got to make the laws. So we have the House of Representatives, which changes every 2 years, which gives us the ability to say, hey, this is the person I want to have making laws for me. And it gave us the Senate, which changes over in full every 6 years. So every 2 years, a third of the Senate changes over. So it goes more slowly. And those get together and they write laws. And from there, the law goes to the president, and the president either can sign the bill into law so it becomes a law, or veto it, in which case it goes back to the Congress and they get to write it again, and the president can decide if it has been changed enough that he's comfortable signing it, or the Congress can override the president and say, you're a weenie, we're going to have the law the way we wanted it, which is pretty rare, by the way. Or they could just drop the law altogether, which is also rare. But the idea here is that the people get to decide the government under which they live, which is, after all, the principles that are outlined in the Declaration of Independence. One of the pieces in the Declaration is the idea that legitimacy of government depends on the consent of the governed, and that's the system that we have set up. All right, so within that system, the idea is that individuals can work as hard as they can and have access to markets. They can sell things. They can be part of an economic system that depends on markets. Now, we now call that capitalism. That is not actually what the framers of the Constitution called it, but America has always had a trade economy. It doesn't have to, but that's what it has now. And in the United States, we have come to think of democracy as being associated with capitalism. Once again, it doesn't have to be, but that's the way we think about it. And that's the idea of capitalism, is the idea that you can work hard, you can accumulate more money than you can use, and with that money you can invest it in other things, and that you have this trade system based in markets. That is an idea, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about capital. These are like little nutshell things, and it's kind of killing me here because I study capitalism and I can't tell you how many nuances I just blew over. But the reason I mention it is because you're hearing all the time nowadays that people who are unhappy with the Trump administration and the influence of Elon Musk in it are somehow anti-capitalism. And they're not anti-capitalism at all. A number of people really believe in capitalism because it promotes innovation, for example, or because it contributes to economic growth, and that economic growth is necessary to bring people in undeveloped countries out of poverty. That's another argument in favor of capitalism, and that most Americans actually line up behind capitalism, but it's not the only way to think about the world. Now, one of the things you hear all the time is that people like me are communists or Marxists. Trump's been saying that all week, that anybody who disagrees with him is a Marxist. Communism is not anything like Trump is talking about. And there's a nuance to that in the United States that I've talked about elsewhere, and I won't now because I'm trying to get you out of here pretty quickly. But communism is a system of government, or socialism are systems of government in which the government doesn't support markets, but rather takes over the means of production. So the farms, the factories, all the systems that produce that in a capitalist system are influenced by markets, in a communist system are owned by the government. Now, do you see anybody around you advocating for the government to take over the factories for the people? The answer to that is absolutely not, because we are so far from that. It just makes me crazy every time I hear him talking about Marxism. Marx was a historian and a political theorist from the middle of the 19th century who had a historical theory about the way that societies developed. That's a really interesting rabbit hole that I'm not going to go into. But when Trump says Marxism, he's talking about communism and saying that people like me are communists because we are unhappy with what's happening right now in the government. We're not communists or Marxist. But there's another kind of government that people really need to understand right now, and that's fascism. Now, fascism is a theory of government that's developed in the 1920s, largely by Benito Mussolini in Italy. And what fascism does is it argues that you're really going to promote a country, not with the kind of individualism that you see under capitalism, or the kind of people power that theoretically one sees under communism. These are theories, by the way. But that the way that you really make a country great is that you meld together business and government, and together those two forces move the people in such a way that they become an army for the country. And they will expand, and they will produce, and they will make a country great if you can convince them to be this army. And one of the ways that you get them to do that is to give them somebody to hate. Now, the reason I think that it's important to understand those concepts is because I want to talk a little bit about the Federal Aviation Administration, which is very much in the news today. The Federal Aviation Administration is part of the U.S. government. And it's part of the U.S. government because, I mean, there's a long, cool history here, but essentially as soon as people started flying, and flying is a really cool story because it actually comes out of, and I'm sorry, I told you I'd be quick, but I think this is so interesting. It actually comes out of the bicycle industry. I mean, doesn't it seem to you like it should come out of the car industry? It doesn't. It comes out of the bicycle industry. But that means it develops in the early 20th century. And when that happens and people start flying in really effective ways, which they do really quickly, as soon as there start to be a lot of people in the air, they start to run into each other. So we get the Federal Aviation Administration, and it takes a while to develop. But it's part of the federal government that is designed to guarantee that people are safe, that you're promoting the welfare of people here so they don't crash into each other over the Grand Canyon, which was one of the big accidents that made people say, hey, we got to have some rules around this. So the FAA is one of the things that's happened since the 1980s is that a lot of government agencies have really been starved because of this idea that if you put money into the government to develop things, that you would, this was communism, and you would take money out of the pockets of those hardworking Americans, even though what was really happening was that $50 trillion was moving from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. So we have an FAA that has done yeoman's service now for a very long time. For 16 years, we did not have a fatal crash, a commercial crash. Of course, that streak ended and has ended over the past couple of weeks as we've had a number of incredibly terrible disasters. Indeed, the FAA needs upgrading. And they've done great stuff, but we have so many people in the air and there's so much activity that, yes, it would be a good thing to have new systems. But what you are seeing right now in this conversation that Trump is talking about and Musk is talking about and Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy is talking about is they're talking about getting rid of the government FAA system and replacing it with one system that is run by a private enterprise and that will work with the government. And it looks pretty clear to people like me, although I could be wrong because I say it's very opaque still, that what they're talking about is using Musk's Starlink system together with his AI systems to move him into the government, to make him that government piece that would operate our federal aviation system. Similarly, you're seeing something that I care deeply about, and that is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. NOAA is the part of our government, scientists, who are who examine the air currents and the ocean currents and the changes in the sky and in the atmosphere and the changes in the oceans to learn about our wind and our weather, our wind and our oceans and our weather and our climate. And one of the things that the administration has been doing and has been threatening to do and is in Project 2025 is to get rid of NOAA, to get rid of the pieces of it that are exploring climate change, for example, because they don't want to say it's real, but also to privatize that information. And again, this is Starlink, this is Musk, these are people who have private weather channels that they would like you to have to pay money to subscribe to. And that again would put money in private people's pockets. But it would take it away from the government, which is, it's being paid for by your tax dollars. But those scientists are operating for the good of everybody through our tax dollars. And just think about what NOAA does. NOAA, by the way, is huge in my life because I'm married to a commercial fisherman. And, we have to know what the water is like and we have to know what the wind is like. But even if you are not married to a commercial fisherman, I suppose there aren't that many of us, you want to know if there's a hurricane coming. You want to know if there's a tornado coming. You want to know if there's going to be unusual rain. And you want to know those things because if you don't know those things, you're going to have happen to you what happened to Texans in Galveston in 1900 when the Galveston when the Galveston hurricane came in and destroyed the town of Galveston. Huge loss of life. Because what happened is the telegraph lines went down. There was a storm along Florida and the coast, but the telegraph lines got knocked out. So Texas didn't know that there was this hurricane coming, and the place and Galveston just got wiped out. Not lots of changes after that, but there too, that seems to me, you can disagree, that seems to me like a good place for the government to be spending my tax dollars rather than making me find a private group of people who might be able to provide that information to me or might not. Some think of some of the private people with whom you work that you're not terribly happy with. So one of the things to think about when you're thinking about this moment is that we hear a lot, those people who are saying that those of us who are unhappy about Musk is that we just love the government, we're getting kickbacks, and we just don't want to cut waste. And I want to be really clear here. Musk has, and his organization of, the Department of Government Efficiency, as I call it, DOGGY, they have not identified any waste. They have not identified fraud. What they have done is they have made cuts that they consider important. That's really important now because you're hearing all through the right-wing media, these people who are objecting to this just love the fraud and they love the corruption. No, that's not what you are seeing. What you are seeing is Musk saying he is cutting fraud and corruption, but what he is cutting are things he doesn't like. And by the way, we don't actually know that that he's cutting anything. He might just be saying he's cutting stuff. As I say, there's an awful lot of obscurity going on here. Um, uh, so I'd just like to point out, when we talk about, this idea of corruption and, these people getting kickbacks and all that, please don't forget that the government, in fact, has a very robust system of policing its accounts. So, for example, healthcare fraud, really big deal. Healthcare fraud, it is a big deal. But the FBI has people that are dedicated just to rooting out healthcare fraud. And you may or may not know that in 2024, they charged 193 people in 32 federal jurisdictions with $1.6 billion worth of fraud. Now, that's a lot of fraud, but I will point out that Senator Rick Scott of Florida was the CEO of a corporation that was brought to court and ended up having to pay what was at the time the highest penalty for healthcare fraud, $1.7 billion. So this does, in fact, have teeth, and it does, in fact, suggest that there are people who might be committing corruption and fraud that don't want the government looking at them. So there is the FBI dedicated to looking after healthcare fraud and other kinds of fraud as well. But there is also something called the GAO, or the General Accountability Office. And that is a nonpartisan, independent office that audits the government all the time. And the GAO is always finding corruption and always cleaning it up. That's their job, to do that. Still, in addition to that, the major departments of the government had independent, nonpartisan inspectors general. And those were established during the Carter administration to audit the government departments. And as you know, Trump fired, or tried to fire, he couldn't legally do that, between 15 and 18 of them as soon as he took office. So this idea that somehow those of us upset about what Musk is doing are in favor of fraud and corruption is wrong. The opposite is true. The Trump administration is cutting the people at the FBI who went after fraud. It is cutting the inspectors general, and it looks like it's trying to replace the General Accountability Office, which does all these things and which has been policing these things all along. At the same time, you have Musk and his doggy boys claiming to be cutting waste, but they're not. They're cutting things they don't like USAID. Now, the problem with that is that there's a huge problem with the idea that you let one person decide what parts of the government he doesn't like. For this simple reason, think about it. You might like some of the cuts he's making. I mean, I promise you, there are pieces of the government that I don't like, that I suspect you do like. That's kind of how it works. That's why we elect our representatives, who get in there and they hash it out and they say, Richardson, you're being a jerk. This town really needs this. Shut up. We're going to give it to them. And I say, okay, I don't like that, but if I don't like it enough, I can replace my representatives and they'll stand up more strongly for me next time. And you might say the coast of Maine does not need whatever it is that Richardson likes. And that's why you elect somebody from Georgia, say, who says, you Mainers got to get your acts together. We don't care about migratory birds down here. That's how the system works. If you let one person go in, then you are ceding all that power to one person. And that's why people are unhappy about Musk mucking around in the government computers, getting our personal information and deciding what he likes and what he doesn't like. Because here's the story. Remember I said how the Constitution is set up, that the Congress makes our laws and the president signs them in? Congress can change those laws anytime it wants. Right now, the Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court. If they don't like USAID, they could pass a law that says we're getting rid of USAID. And Trump could sign it, and the Supreme Court could say, okie dokie, if you want that, that's what you get. And we would be rid of USAID. And people like me could say, crap, we don't really like that. but we couldn't really do anything except advocate for a different outcome with different representatives, or hold rallies and say we really care about USAID or the things that we care about. But that's not what they're doing, because they know Americans like USAID. Americans like the members of Congress would not vote to kill USAID. So rather than letting it go through the system that our Constitution sets up, they're saying, this is efficiency. We're just going to let Musk do it or Donald Trump do it. Now, here's the problem. You might not like USAID. Like I say, we could have a reasonable discussion about that. But if they can cut one program, they can cut any program, which is, again, unbelievably unconstitutional, which is what all the courts so far have said about it. But you know what? It's a big money sink? Social Security. Now, I happen to think that's incredibly important to our country in oh so many ways. Musk might disagree. You might disagree. But if they can let one guy go in and cut against the Constitution, cut one program, there is nothing stopping them from cutting any other program. And that's why people like me are screaming about Musk cutting USAID. It's a slippery slope. That is exactly how you end up with a country that is run by a single man, with either fascism, which is the idea that you have some people are better than others and have the right to rule, and eventually gets an authoritarian, or simply jumping straight to the idea of an authoritarian. So what I would suggest is that when you think about the place we are right now, you think about a different story than, oh my God, I'm going to hold back these cuts or these cuts or these cuts, and I have to defend U.S. aid and corruption to my neighbor who says that anybody who likes U.S. aid is corrupt and all that. No. I urge you to think about the story that has held America together since the very beginning. That essentially we created a government in which people got to rule themselves. And we set up rules to do that. We set up the idea of a Congress that makes our laws, 2 houses of it, and a president who either signs those laws or doesn't, and whose power is checked by that Congress, who can impeach the president, and whose power is checked by the courts, who can say, no, that's unconstitutional. And that we have this idea that we as individuals get to have a government that answers to us. And the Constitution of that government says that the laws have to make sure that we're all treated equally before the law. No exceptions. We all are treated equally before the law. No exceptions for LGBTQ plus people. No exceptions for black people. No exceptions for women. No exceptions for brown people. We get to be treated equally before the law. We also get to have a say in our government. So all these laws trying to keep us from voting, no. We get to have a say in our government. And that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. One of the things that constantly surprises me is, I'm really good at certain things, but I'm really bad at others. And it always amuses me when I've missed something so obvious that a student says to me, or somebody will say to me, here's a great example. Great blizzards of a few years back, 2016 or whatever it was. My neighbor came to me. We've been neighbors for many, many years. And he came to me and he said, Heather, I had a very long driveway at the time. And he came, and I was shoveling it every day. And he came to me and said, Heather, I have to ask, and I hope you don't mind me getting involved here, but why don't you park your car at the end of your driveway instead of up to the front of the house, and then just shovel a path from the house to the car? It had never occurred to me. I had lived there 25 years. I'd shoveled that expletive driveway for 25 years. And as the minute he said it, I was like, of course. That's why you want everyone to vote. Because some people are really good at some things and some people are really good at other things. And if it had been only up to me, I'd have shoveled that stupid driveway until the day I sold the house. That's why you want to make sure everybody votes. And you also want to make sure that everybody has equal access to the resources that will enable them to contribute to society. Not simply because it means that they're prosperous and that crime goes down and that people are nicer to each other and that people have more fulfilled lives, but also because it helps the country to build wealth, to have hospitals and roads and parks and the things that make our and art and museums and the things that make our lives worth living. Those things are all the job of the federal government to do, because the federal government is us. Now, we can disagree about what that looks like. Maybe you don't want the government to fund a museum that deals with some kind of art you don't like, and I think it's a great idea. That's why we have representatives in Congress, is to hash that out. And we're never, any one of us, going to be happy 100% of the time. But that story that our government is about our ability to make rules for ourselves, rather than turning it over to one guy, whether it's Donald Trump or J.D. Vance or Musk or pick your flavor of George Soros or anybody else, that story that we get to construct our own country is the story of humanity. It's the story of being able to choose your future, to determine your future. And that idea is absolutely not some crazy lefty idea. Or if it is, you have to look to people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is the one who really began to articulate the idea that the government should hold the playing field level for very rich people and very poor people, which were his people. It's the same idea that people like Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican like Abraham Lincoln was, brought to the U.S. government to say, wait a minute, in an era of industrialization when the factories are getting so powerful and Andrew Carnegie can have an entire city block that belongs to him, that maybe the government needs to get involved to make sure that those businesses are regulated, and that we do have a safety net so that children don't lose their hands in machines, because aside again from the morality of it, a child who is crippled from an industrial accident is not going to be able to be a good citizen and contribute to this idea of a growing, expanding nation that provides for the good of everybody. If it's a lefty idea, it's a lefty idea embraced by somebody like Dwight Eisenhower, who not only called for things like the establishment of foreign aid, but also during his time had a progressive tax that capped out at 91%. So anybody who sits there telling you how great the 1950s were and doesn't talk about the fact that in the 1950s we had a progressive tax that had an upper tax bracket of 91% is deluding themselves. This idea that what the government is supposed to do is to promote the general welfare, and that those of us who are defending it are the people who are in line with our greatest traditions and with the traditions of the people who fought during the Civil War and fought to make America a progressive nation, and who fought in World War II, and who since then have tried to enable the rest of the world to have a rising standard of living, to make sure we didn't have things like nuclear wars. We are not some group of radicals. We are, in a very profound sense, conservative. We are trying to conserve the best of the American nation and the best of the concepts of the founders of the Declaration of Independence and the framers of the Constitution. So one of the things that would be good to do this weekend is to think about the different ways and to talk about the different ways in which the federal government touches your lives. And that's, of course, everything from reworking the roads and to repairing the roads and to trying to help us transition to a green economy. But it has its stupid things like NOAA, like looking at the weather report and knowing that you're safe on the water, or knowing that it's okay to drive across the mountains. It's the idea of people having housing support. It's the idea of really poor schools, many of which are in the top 7 of which I think it is, maybe it's the top 6 of which are Republican-dominated states, are going to get grants to make schooling available to poor children. It's about making sure there's housing available. It's about making sure that special needs kids actually have the funding so that they too can participate in society in the same way that people who don't have special needs that need to be addressed in the K through 12 schools have. It's in a number of places that I think our story has not been told for a really, really long time, because there's been this story that somehow the government is bad and is doing bad things. But, how many of you out there know people who've been on WIC? WIC is a fabulous program. It's help for people who need it for a little bit of time, and it helps to have healthy infants, children, and mothers. I mean, we ought to articulate the good parts of our government and the parts that we do not want to see slashed by an independent organization that does not have the constitutional or the legal authority to get rid of those programs, cut on the whim of the richest man in the world, which is, again, right back where we started. What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to have control over your destiny? And what is the US government supposed to be in relation to us as individuals? Is it completely supposed to stay out of our lives and enable anybody to make as much money as they possibly can and treat the rest of us however they wish? Or is it supposed to guarantee that we are treated equally before the law, have a right to say in our government, and have access to a level playing field through business regulation, a basic social safety net, promotion of infrastructure, and protection of civil rights? That's where I am. That's what I care about. And I feel like the majority of Americans agree with that. They just don't know it's their story as far more than that one that's been shoved down our throats for 40 years. So to the degree you can think about that and start to articulate the pieces of the federal government that matter to you and put them in social media posts, but also put them in phone calls to your Congress critters and to the people at the state level, and say, listen, I really care about NOAA, or I really care about WIC, or I really care about SNAP. And you might care about SNAP not because anybody you know is using SNAP on the receiving side, but SNAP's part of our agriculture department. So you might be using you might be a farmer who's involved with SNAP from that side. Think about the places that the federal government matters to you, how you interact with it, or will interact with it someday. We are all, if we are lucky enough to live that long, going to need Social Security and going to need Medicare. Think about those things, articulate them, and let's make that be the American story again, not the idea that our government workers are somehow corrupt and looking for a kickback. Because I'll tell you, in the time that, I'm 62 years old, and sure, I've known sleazebags. We all have, right? But the people I know who are scientists for NSF, the people I know who work in Congress, the people and the staffers, the people who work for housing programs, they are not doing it for the kickbacks. They're doing it because they care, because this is their skill set, because they feel like they're doing something to contribute to a larger community. And I think that's what we need right now. So I wanted to come on here and really push back against the idea that somehow if you're mad about Musk, it's just because you're selfish and corrupt. The opposite is true. People like me care about the foundations of the United States government and the idea that we will not do unconstitutional or illegal things. And we care about the idea that that government is designed to do something that it is doing for the American people, and that I anyway, would like to see it continue without it being taken over by a few individuals who run global corporations. All right. Almost an hour there. Sorry about that. I thought I'd be quicker. I hope I touched enough. Hope you all have a wonderful Friday night. I expect to write briefly tonight, I hope. And I don't know when I'll come back on. I'm going to do these a lot more frequently now, just because it seems to be that I get a different audience here, and they're way easier for me than writing. Those letters and I will keep doing the writing. Every night I will write for you. But those take take many, 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 many hours, whereas these are way quicker because so much of it is already in my head, and I don't have to type it. Have a great Friday night. Thank you for being here. Hey, Danny, how are you? Ricky, Middletown, Connecticut, Long Island. Bet it's called, oh, Valley Forge. You know I'm fond of Valley Forge. Texas, Georgia, Gainesville, Virginia, San Diego, St. Augustine, Florida. Man, that's a historic town. If you haven't been to the old fort, you should go. Oh, an unlikely story. Hey, Linda, how are you? Great bookstore in Plainville, Massachusetts. Plainville. You went by too fast. I don't remember which it is. I think it's Plainville. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I think I told you I once did Flat Stanley for a child, you know, the paper doll that goes places. And I took him to Baton Rouge. And we did Baton Rouge, me and Flat Stanley, to the point that when I sent the doll onward, and the parents later said to me that that was lovely, but they were not going to send me anywhere with the doll anymore because they were exhausted from how much Flat Stanley did. But we did the history of Baton Rouge and the State House and the river and the trees. We had a good time. At least I did. Powell's, wow, and another favorite bookstore. All right, we got a lot of people here, so I'll go ahead and start. There were fewer specific questions than usual this week, and I have to say I didn't spend quite as much time as I normally do because I hadn't had a chance to grocery shop in so long. We were like down to no food at all, so I just got back from the grocery store. But there is one that I want to call out because Danny asked about it, although you got it all right, Danny, and that is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, or the SAVE Act, that the Republicans have reintroduced in this Congress. And I'm going to start there because it says a lot about where we are in this moment. They are putting forward this measure because they insist that our elections are not secure. And what this does is it requires people to produce in-person identification in order to vote, with the argument that this will keep non-citizens from voting. But you need to step back a little bit and see what's going on here. It's already illegal for non-citizens to vote, and they don't. I mean, the amount of voter fraud we have in this country is vanishingly rare. And by voter fraud, I mean the conditions in which an individual tries to vote illegally. If it happens, it's usually a misunderstanding, as in there was a case recently where the person was told by the registrar they could vote, and then it turned out they couldn't. Really, 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 really rare. I mean, like, you have a much better chance of getting hit by lightning twice than of voter fraud in this country. But what you do have in this country is election fraud, and that's something altogether different. And the focus on voter fraud has really obscured our focus on election fraud, which is when a party uses voter suppression or different kinds of laws to skew the vote in such a way that it benefits them. And this SAVE Act, which sets out to combat voter fraud, is actually a form of election fraud. And what I mean by that is that this measure, by requiring these documents in order to prove you're a citizen, does something really nefarious. And the first of those things is that one of the things you can use is your passport. But about 140 million Americans don't have passports, and it's not easy to get a passport. That is, it's not difficult, but it's expensive and it's very time consuming if you've ever tried to do it. You know, it takes a number of weeks, many weeks, to get a passport. And so it's cumbersome to get one. But here's the other thing, and you saw this, by the way, in Texas a while back if you were watching. There was a specific time Texas did this as well. The other piece of the SAVE Act that is deeply, deeply concerning is that you need to have identification that matches who you are now, matches the name you have now, which makes sense, right? You think, oh, well, of course, it's the name you were given at birth, and you just use your real name. But think about whose legal names change as they get older. Women who get married, choose to take their husband's names. And when they do that, they no longer match their birth certificate. So that's about 69 million women in America who could lose the right to vote under this Save Act that they're pushing. Again, there is no problem it's solving. It is creating a problem by making sure that people who are American citizens can't vote. And that kind of brings up the larger thing that I wanted to talk about today, because, you know, we're in this mess. It's a constitutional crisis. I read somewhere today where someone said the beginnings of a constitutional crisis. No, we're in a constitutional crisis. And I will tell you more about that. But I think for me, as I step back, because things are coming at us so much all the time, which as they are designed to do to make us exhausted, it helps really to stop being in the pinball machine and think about what our relationship is to our government. And by that, I mean, rather than simply reacting to the last thing that the Trump administration or the Department of Government Efficiency, which we don't quite know what it is, but the Doggy Brothers or Elon Musk or Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, the last thing that they have done, although they've done plenty, is to think about what we want our government to do and how we got to a point when we're in the middle of a coup. And that, I think, provides us a way to think about going forward. So let me start there. American democracy has had a number of crises in the 240, well, it's been less than that, but the period of time in which it has existed since 1789, when the Constitution went into effect. And what that means is that there are stresses on democracy that it's not initially equipped to handle. So if you think about the 1830s and the 1840s into the 1850s, democracy had to contend with what at the time was a huge problem for it. And I'm not talking about the people or the people who got hurt or any of that. I'm talking about the concept of democracy, the concept that we have a right to have a say in our government and be treated equally before the law and have equal access to resources. And in that era, what really was a struggle for democracy, the concept and the way it worked, was westward expansion. What did it mean when you took in all this land, all these new people, and you had the ability for certain people to take over the resources more quickly than others did, as in the elite enslavers? Well, we almost lost our democracy at that point, but during the late 1850s and the 1860s and the 1870s, Americans found ways to make their democracy able to function with these new lands that had come under the purview of the American government during that early period in the 19th century. But then they had to face another crisis, and that next crisis was the crisis of industrialization, because the whole idea of having this government that would protect people's ability to rise to prosperity by guaranteeing they were treated equally before the law, that they had a right to a say in their government, and that they had equal access to resources, that was supposed to make sure that everybody was sort of on a level playing field. But by the 1870s and then the 1880s, it was really clear that once again, some people had monopolized resources much more fully than other people had for one reason or another. And that meant you had the problem of somebody like Andrew Carnegie, who was, crazy rich, operating on the same field as an inner city immigrant or native-born woman, child, worker, male worker, and democracy had to figure out if in fact you could survive that way. And one of the things that President Theodore Roosevelt really articulates and put into place is, no, you can't have a democracy where there are a few incredibly rich guys who monopolize everything, and then everybody else works for them and barely can eat and can't make ends meet and don't get education and don't understand how the world works because they're going to vote and they won't have any idea what they're voting for, and that will destroy democracy. So once again, then we get the progressive era in which people figure out how to make democracy adjust to the rise of large fortunes. We get it again. We get another problem in the 1920s when we get a situation very similar to that, and we get the crash of the economy. And from that, the rebuilding of what we now have as the modern state. in the 1930s, and the real stress is on democracy of globalization, of having to interact with other countries, both in terms of trade and in terms of colonialism and in terms of war, that they had to figure out how to make that work. And now we're in another crisis of democracy, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And that has come from one place that people really recognize that it comes from is the idea that we believed that we, meaning certain leaders in the United States, believed that if you spread capitalism, you would also spread democracy. They did not think those two things could be divorced, and we know now that's wrong, that in fact you can have capitalism without democracy. So that's part of where the problem comes from. But I would argue, and I'm going somewhere with this, by the way, I would argue that the crisis that we are facing in the United States and around the world right now is a crisis of propaganda, of democracy having to grapple with a small group of people who are monopolizing the world, and they are able to do so through lies. And I've talked before about virtual politics, which is, or political technology, which is a political idea that is articulated out of Russia, although personally I don't believe that's where it came from. But the idea that you can make people vote away their democracy essentially by lying to them. There's a number of different pieces to it. There's blackmail, there's getting people to run for office as a member of one party and then switching. There's getting people to challenge someone by the same name so that you siphon off votes for the other candidate and pull them toward a false candidate, and therefore the reactionary right person wins. There's flooding the zone with crap, as Steve Bannon, who's a media guy, puts it, to overwhelm people so they step away from the political arena and turn it over to strongmen or to reactionary authoritarians. Or there is lying. There is propaganda, and controlling the way people think through propaganda by telling them a story that resonates with them, and as a result they begin to do things that don't answer their own needs and their own interests because they are voting based on that lie. It's a lie. We need to call it a lie. And I feel like, as I look at the moment we're in, that's what I am seeing. We are seeing the collapse of American democracy because of the lies that we began to embrace in the 1950s. The idea that a government that works for everybody was actually, according to the lie, redistributing wealth from hardworking white people, at first to black people, after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 said that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, but that is going to include brown people, it's going to include religious minorities, it's going to include gender minorities, and it's going to include women as well. That lie, the idea that the heart of America is really that cowboy who does it on his own and who is taking on the empire that is trying to kill his independence, and that is taking wealth away from him to give it to undeserving people. That lie has gotten us now to the point where we are really, not we, there's a small group of people, the MAGA Republicans, who believe that the only way to interact with other individuals, or appear to believe that, is through strongmen, is through this concept of strength and violence and a real denigration of the values of society that have created, as I said last week, real wealth. And by that I don't just mean gold in the bank, I mean education and roads and hospitals and art and better standards of living for people around the world, but certainly I'm thinking of in the United States. And so we're seeing right now the takeover of our society by Elon Musk. With the argument that everything that he is doing is he is destroying waste. But that's a lie. Again, just to emphasize here, he has not produced any evidence that he has cut any waste at all. What he is doing is he is throwing out programs that he personally doesn't agree with. So what we're seeing in this moment is this real destruction of the US government that we have built since the 1930s to make sure people are treated equally before the law, to guarantee that we have a right to have a say in our government, and that we have access to resources to enable us to work hard and to create the kind of life we want. And we are destroying all of that, or Doggy and President Trump are destroying those things as part of this argument that all these things are waste that hurt individuals' ability to be the best they can be. And so if you think about that framing, the idea that we are living a lie, that's kind of a helpful way to get into the ways to push back against that. And what I would like to suggest today, and I will tell you more about what's happening in Washington and what's happening around the states, but what I would like to suggest today is, if you've looked at the last week anyway, probably 10 days, what you are seeing around the country are people who voted for the MAGA Republicans on this because of this lie, because they believed that the government was wasting their tax dollars by giving it to, as Elon Musk lied yet again today, to a drag opera in some other country. That was a lie. They voted based on that idea, and what they are discovering with this destruction of the US government, that in fact that government really was working for everybody. And so you're seeing this really in horrific ways among the American farming community that is now recognizing that US aid buys $2 billion worth of US agricultural products every year. It is the major buyer, I believe, of soybeans from Tennessee. Tennessee, deeply Republican-dominated state, and now they're in real trouble. But not just that. All sorts of federal grants for farmers, all the different pieces that we have put in place since the 1930s to support our agricultural community are simply being thrown away by Musk and his people. Now, it's not just that. It's also education now is on the chopping block, and that's horrifying. Largely, again, Republican-dominated states where a lot of their funding, we've always known this, comes from the federal government. Certainly, the cuts to the National Institutes of Health are badly hurting the red states. Now, they're going to hurt all the states, but it's red states, it's Republican-dominated states that really depend on that money. And here's something that's been in the news today. It is not part of a bill yet, or part of a measure yet, but the Republicans in the House that are trying to come up with some kind of a budget plan, which I'll tell you more about, are talking about what they call the enormous waste of Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. Similarly, Musk has said he believes that that's where the real waste is, because as we know, those are extremely expensive programs. Now, you might agree with that those are programs we should throw out. I don't believe that myself. So if you're thinking about this moment, to go again sort of full circle here in this argument that I'm trying to make, what do you think the US government should do? So I think that what the US government should do is exactly what's set out in the Declaration of Independence. It should protect everybody's right to equality before the law. I don't care if you're disabled. I don't care if you're old. I don't care if you're, put anything in that blank. Our laws say you have a right to be treated equally, including as if you're the richest man in the world. You should be treated equally before the law. I also believe, and this speaks to that SAVE Act, that we should have a right to have a say in our government, and that's very much under attack. And I also believe that the government should give us all equal access to resources. And by that, I don't just mean the ability to get a job. I think we should have equal protection for hiring, but also equal rights to education and to health care, to the things that are the building blocks of enabling people to compete fairly in the United States. And this is straight, by the way, out of Theodore Roosevelt, so I'm hardly being radical here. But what we are seeing right now is the concentration of power among a very small group of people who don't think that that's what government should do. They believe that government should not help ordinary Americans, that that's a waste of money, that that is a waste, that education, all of those things should depend on your income level, the color of your skin, your abilities, any of those different categories that they have put in place, because they really think that they appear to think they are better than the rest of us are, and some of them have said so in writing. And that what we really need to do is concentrate the extraordinary wealth of the American people. Because remember, when we talk about the government, we're talking about ourselves. And when we talk about how wealthy the US government is, we're talking about ourselves. That they think they should concentrate that wealth and make sure that it goes into the hands of a very few people. Now, people like Elon Musk believe they need control over that wealth, and Peter Thiel to some degree, although they shift a little bit as to their ultimate goals. But Elon Musk believes that humanity is going to die out, and a very few lucky, he would say talented people are going to be able to go and colonize other planets as the rest of us die behind here on Earth. And in order for him to be able to make that happen, to be one of those people, he needs the wealth of the United States government and the power of Earth to do that. That's his vision. Maybe it's your vision. It's not my vision. So the whole reason I set all that up was because when you're thinking about this moment and people are so frightened, we have to stop letting that small group of people define the way we think about the country and define the way we talk about it. So again, people are sending me stuff all the time from their brother-in-law, their uncle, whomever, saying, or even some of their members of Congress saying it's absolutely not true. It's a leftist lie that the Department of Government Efficiency has broken into the U.S. payment system in the Treasury, and that is a lie. They have, at least if you're going to believe the courts, the investigators, the people who are talking about these things. So we need to stop believing in the lie and pushing back against the lie with the truth. And by that, I would start with the idea that what Elon Musk is doing is cutting waste. There has been no evidence that he has found any waste at all. And courts have said that. What he is doing is cutting things he doesn't like. And, as people like me keep saying, the Republicans have controlled the House of Representatives, the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court. If they had the support to make the cuts that Musk is doing, they could do that. But they're not doing it because they are so bitterly divided themselves over these things that they would rather have him do it. And what you're seeing here, the most extreme MAGA Republicans going, oh, I like what he's doing because he's cutting waste. And the other ones keeping their mouth shut because they know it's really unpopular. And it's going to be more unpopular as this month and the next plays out, because if in fact they cut Medicaid the way they are talking about, what a lot of people don't think about when they think about government programs is the true trickle-down effect they have. That is, you might be upset if the elderly person in your life loses Medicaid, which is a lot of what supports nursing homes. But nursing homes also depend on that money. So if those things stop coming, if that money stops coming through, those facilities could end. And that means that even if your grandmother is not a Medicaid recipient, you will not have that service for your relative. And I think you're seeing this all over as you are watching in just the last few days, the economy really starting to falter, small businesses deciding they're not going to make capital investments any longer, that they're very concerned about economic stagnation and even recession and possibly depression, because once you take all this money out of the US economy, money that does things like, keeps our farmers able to produce things, keeps our weather systems going, keeps cancer research going. Once you pull all that out, all those people lose jobs, and all the effects of the multipliers of that money are going to disappear. So when Musk talks about waste, stop accepting that. He is not talking about waste. He is literally that death panel that Republicans talked about when they were trying to kill the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare back in 2010 and in the years after 2010 that made it so impossible. He is literally defunding cancer research. That's what the National Institutes of Health spends most of its money on, cancer research. So instead of saying, yes, I love the cuts in this waste, as I'm hearing from some people, literally from one person who works in a hospital, show me the waste, because he's not saying that. He's saying he thinks it's waste. These are programs, of course, that Congress has put in place, and instead what we are seeing is the decimation of the people's government, which is what we need to be framing it as, and we need to be protecting. All right, so let me go into a little more about what is happening at the national level. So I keep saying we're in a constitutional crisis, and we are. And I left my soda on the other side of the room, I guess. What I mean by that is this. I'm going to reiterate this. I keep saying this, and apparently even some Congress people don't understand it. The way our Constitution is written, the power in the Constitution comes from the people. It starts out, we the people. So we give our power to an elected set of representatives in order to create laws for us. And that's why we get to reelect them all the time, because if we don't like what they're doing, we're supposed to be able to grab them back and say, no, we don't want you. We want to try someone else. So we give our power to the government. And the Constitution sets up how that's going to happen. The first article of the Constitution, it's called Article 1. It's got a whole bunch of subsections, and that sets up how we write our laws. It's the Congress that writes our laws, and the House of Representatives is reelected every 2 years. Everybody comes up for election every 2 years, so it'll be close to us. And they are the House of Representatives is the only body that is able to initiate revenue measures. Nobody else can do it. It's the House of Representatives. They write laws, or the Senate writes laws if they're not about revenue, and then once they pass through their house, they have to pass through the other house. Once a measure passes both the House and the Senate turns over 1/3 of it every 2 years. It can turn over in full every 6 years, although it doesn't. People stay in the Senate forever. Then it goes to the president, and the president either signs it, and then it becomes a law, or vetoes it, and then it goes back to the Congress, and the Congress can either pass it over as veto, or can rewrite it, or can just say, oh, never mind, we didn't mean it anyway, which they almost never do. The reason I make such a big deal about that is because that's the way we have given Congress power. They write the laws. And once the president has signed that measure into law, nobody can change it except Congress or the Supreme Court that can say, and it took this duty on itself, by the way, in 1803, but the Supreme Court can say, nah, it's unconstitutional, in which case it has to be rewritten. It's no longer in power. It has to be rewritten. You can change the Constitution, you can change the law, you can do a bunch of things, but the president can't suddenly say, no, I don't like that law, I'm going to throw it out. There's no way in which the American people have given the president the power to do that. In fact, when Richard Nixon tried it in the 1970s, in 1974, Congress explicitly wrote a law saying, not a freaking chance, dude, you can't do that. So what you're seeing right now is the Trump administration having empowered in some fashion, it's all very opaque, Elon Musk, who was not elected, and if you remember, during the campaign, he was supposed to be an advisory person and was just going to give advice, and now all of a sudden he's apparently making these cuts. What they are doing right now is saying, yeah, we can do that. The president can simply decide laws on his own, and the cutting of the government, the way he is doing it, is completely reconfiguring the laws that our Congress has written. So, for example, he has gotten rid of the election security teams. He has gotten rid of the laws that say you can't bribe foreign officials. He has gotten rid of the laws that protect us against foreign interference in our government, in our elections. I mean, what he has done is he's gotten rid of the pieces of our government that help all of us in order to concentrate them with power in one person, and that would be the president, although this particular president is not really apparently the person in power. But that's the idea, is to create this extraordinary president. The person who's really behind the concept of this is now the director of the Office of Management and Budget, a man named Russell Vought. He helped to write Project 2025, and he calls this post-constitutionalism. We'll get beyond the Constitution, get rid of the need to do anything through Congress, and concentrate all the power in the presidency. Now, having thrown overboard the Congress, now in the last couple of days, although J.D. Vance has been talking about it now for months, the Republicans are starting to say they don't think the courts should have any say in what the executive branch does either. Now, what that says is that they are throwing out the Constitution. They're going to get rid of the Constitution and instead have a one strong man who is in power and can run the government however he wants. In this particular case, like I say, it's theoretically Trump, but Trump is not mentally okay. So obviously J.D. Vance is trying to set this up for himself, and Elon Musk is operating in there as well. It's unclear where the next set of power is going to go, because actually I think it was just yesterday somebody asked Trump if he saw J.D. Vance as his successor, and he said no, which I shouldn't laugh, I'm sorry. But anyway, excuse me for that. Anyway, so what do we do if we have, and mind you, once again, this is a very small group of people. If the Republicans could get these things through Congress, they would do it. But the MAGA Republicans do not control Congress. They control maybe, no, they don't really even control that. They have power in the House of Representatives. The Republicans as a whole have control of both the House and the Senate. But they know, until, what did somebody say? Until a couple of weeks ago, people like Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas were gung-ho for USAID, the Agency for International Development, recognizing how incredibly important it is. But because Musk wants to get rid of it, and now Trump wants to get rid of it, all of a sudden they're saying, oh, no, it's doing all this terrible stuff. They know that the U.S. government needs to do these things if they're going to protect the U.S. economy, the U.S. people, and American power around the world. So what we've got instead is this really small group of people who are destroying our government to concentrate wealth. And I always say with anything, but certainly in this case, watch the money, because where's the first place that Musk went and the Department of Government Efficiency, or Doggy, went? To the Treasury. And they took everybody's information. It seems pretty clear to me that they're intending to build out some kind of an information/financial system that depends on Musk. And then he never has to worry about money again for the rest of his life, because every penny of the U.S. government will go through his hands. So, or that's theoretically the plan, I think. So when you're thinking about this moment, remember there aren't very many people. But remember, too, that we need to redefine what's happening here. The majority of us need to redefine what we want our country to do. And I believe that a majority of us liked the government we had. I mean, that's not to say that you agreed with everything or that I agreed with everything, but I believe our government should fund cancer research, because I can't do it on my own, and I care about that. And I believe our government should fund education, and I believe our government should support family farms, because if we go all the way to agribusiness, the way that Project 2025 asks for us to do, or says we should do, then that not only rips apart the fabric of the country, but it also makes us extraordinarily dependent on a very few companies, which is how we got into the supply chain crises we were in during the COVID problem, the worst of the COVID pandemic. So I believe that the government has a role to play in supporting the economy, in making resources available, and also making sure we're all treated equally before the law. And that involves making sure that we don't have the ability to discriminate against people in hiring or in going to schools, and in all the things that we had in place before the MAGA Republicans started slashing everything. Okay, so what does that mean in a practical sense? What that means is that we need to keep up pressure on elected representatives to stand up for the power of Congress and to stand up for the power of the courts and to push back against the MAGA Republicans. Are they going to listen to you? No, not all of them. But you're already starting to see a number of Republicans backing away from Musk, which is the first thing that needs to happen. And the really key thing about popular opinion is that unless this government has popular opinion behind it, it does not have any legitimacy. Remember, we the people. So what you're seeing right now is the attempt of people like Elon Musk and the MAGA Republicans to convince people that what they're doing is great, cutting waste or getting rid of DEI, although I don't believe any one of them could actually explain what that is. You're seeing them using this false language, this propaganda that got us to where we are, and you're still seeing people kind of shaking their fists and saying, yeah, I want to get rid of waste. But now is the time to point out that their version of waste is things that other people think are vitally important, like cancer research, like Social Security, like education support for the poorest schools, which, by the way, are overwhelmingly in Republican-dominated states, like support for farming, again, rural communities. All these things that they are cutting are really badly hurting the regions that voted for Donald Trump. And this is the time really to push on that construction of how we think about the country. Nobody elected Elon Musk. Nobody decided that we wanted to give over this country to the richest man in the world and in the process starve our own people, let alone the people that USAID was supporting. That's going to be really important to hit on and to hit on hard, because right now the power of the MAGA Republicans and the power of Musk and Trump is slipping. I know I'm going to see in the comments, what about the poll that says Trump has 53% popularity? That's an outlier. And both of their numbers are dropping precipitously, especially Elon Musk. Right now, and we haven't really started to feel the real bite of what's going to happen, as in fact we see the destruction of USAID and of the Department of Education and of the NIH. And what you're seeing there is, I think, their attempt to break everything on the ground so that it can't be rebuilt. And this, again, is part of Musk's philosophy. You destroy everything, and then from it, you rebuild the pieces that are important. And of course, the people who are in charge of those pieces are a few very, very wealthy oligarchs. Somebody asked me in one of the questions here, why on earth are they destroying our power in other countries? Because you can see why they want to have all the US power to themselves, but why ruin our power overseas? And here's another thing I want to emphasize today. Part of what you are seeing is the fact that there is not uniformity on the part of even the MAGA Republicans. So you've got a lot of different interests going on there. What Trump pulled with Canada and Mexico and to some degree China it was heinous, in that he broke those relationships, decades of friendship that will not come back in our lifetimes. And you can already see this if you are not watching. You can see this in the numbers of Canadians who have canceled tourist trips to America, which is going to hurt my state of Maine terribly this summer. And you've also seen it in the fact that already both Mexico and Canada are making bilateral trade agreements with other countries than the U.S. They say, we can't take the risk any longer of you deciding not to take our products and us having to tariff your soybeans and so on. So instead, I think it's Canada just did a deal, I believe it was with Ecuador, simply cutting out the U.S. product that had filled that need in Canada. That was Trump, I think, trying to exercise the idea that he could do whatever he wanted. He'd been told not to do tariffs. He often does that sort of oppositional defiant disorder thing where he goes, you can't make me do anything. And so he goes ahead and does it. Those tariffs went on and off in less than 24 hours. They actually never took effect, but he threatened and took them off in less than 24 hours. But the damage has been huge. Now, there's other things going on, though, than that, and the destruction of the power there. It's a little unclear. A lot is opaque. I've talked to you about this before, but it certainly seems as if the reason that Musk went after U.S. aid is because U.S. aid was looking into the fact that, do you remember when the war first broke out, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and Musk talked about how he was giving his Starlink satellites to the Ukrainians? Well, he didn't give them to the Ukrainians. USAID bought them. But if you remember, there were a couple of really crucial moments when the Starlink went down and the Ukrainians were operating blind because Starlink went down. Well, it appears that USAID was looking into that. And now, of course, there is no USAID to do that. And that, it could be that we lost USAID because Elon Musk did not want that looked into. So that could be what's going on there. But then there's also China. I think you're going to see a lot of the attempt of people like Elon Musk to ally with China because it's such a huge market for him. And because he really, his biggest factory is in China. And it's China. It could be nationalized tomorrow if they wanted it to. And I'm exaggerating, it couldn't literally be done tomorrow. But he needs to stay on the good side of China. So if that means doing things like getting rid of U.S. aid, which has been a huge hedge around the world of American soft power that China really would love to take over. If that means getting rid of U.S. aid so China can go in and take over where the U.S. is pulled back, it's a win-win for him. So I think you're going to see a lot of jockeying among the different groups of people in MAGA itself who want different things from different countries. But again, instead of worrying a lot about that, what do we want? What do we Americans want from our government? And that's really worth hanging on to as we define what this new period is going to look like going forward. Because again, I like our government, and I feel like we haven't said enough of that lately. When, the real kicker for me, I said this before, and one of the reasons I highlighted Mr. Grimkowski was because I can't live without NOAA, without the national organization that looks at our wind and our weather and our oceans and our climate, because that's part of my everyday life. And the idea that they're going to start charging for it and we're going to see how it, how this works. And I'm quite fond of the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, because I like it when our planes don't fall out of the sky. Now, your needs might be different, but I'm perfectly happy to fund the needs that you want, so long as you can fund the needs that I want, because those are things we cannot do by ourselves, and that the government should do. And you know whose idea that was? Abraham Lincoln's. It's Abraham Lincoln who first begins to articulate the idea that the role of the government is to do the things that people can't do individually, but can do as a group, sort of an early form of crowdsourcing. Now, let me add one more piece to this that I would really like to see us talking about. And that's that I am hearing everywhere on the right the idea that we spend way too much money and we have to make more cuts. And if that means Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security or NOAA or the NIH or whatever, we have to make those because we spend too much money. I'm going to reiterate, in terms of our GDP, the US government spends no more money today than it did in the 1950s. What is different is our tax rates. And until the 1990s, really, when America had a debt that they wanted to pay, there's a reason you actually carry a national debt. But the budget was operating in the red and we wanted to pay down the debt. You know what we did? We taxed people with money. And this was not controversial. It was a given. If the U.S. went to war, it had to tax people. If the U.S. had to pay back for a war, like in World War II, it taxed people. And Congress would talk about it and they would say, but we can't tax everybody the same because that would really hurt poorer people. And there's all these people who have all this money. They should pay more. And I always like to remind you that during the Eisenhower administration, the top income tax bracket in the United States, and by that, it doesn't mean when you're in the bracket, everything you pay is at that level. It means that for this much you pay a certain amount, for this much you pay a certain amount, and so on. The top tax bracket under Eisenhower in the 1950s was 91%. Now, right now, Elon Musk, whose Tesla made billions of dollars last year, paid $0 in income tax. $0. The amount they cut out of the National Institutes of Health was $4 billion. If you had taxed Elon Musk 1%, it would have been $4 billion. So this idea that somehow we're in this financial crunch and the only way that we can fix the financial crunch is to destroy all the aspects of our government that provide things for the majority of us, in order to make sure that a very few people can walk away with a whole bunch of money, that's completely antithetical to what the U.S. government ever stood for. All right, so you're asking more questions here let me see if I can get some more of these. So if that's the crisis that we're in, and that's one of the ways to push back, one of the other things to be watching right now that I'm seeing references to, and again, the language is really important here. People, especially on the right, are trying to say that the Democrats are about to shut down the government. Call it out. That is not what's going on here. The Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court. They can do anything they want. They really could do anything they want, with some limits. The thing about the upcoming budget crisis is that they're doing it under what's called reconciliation, which means they can do it with 50 votes, so the Democrats can't filibuster. On other things, the Democrats could filibuster in the Senate. But what's happening is that the Republicans in the House of Representatives, but also in the Senate, are so bitterly divided that they cannot agree on how to fund the government. And so in order to get a measure through the House, even though they've got a majority of the votes, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who's a Republican of Louisiana, will need to get Democratic votes in order to do that. And the Democrats aren't quite sure what they should do because they don't want to shut down the government. But by the same token, they don't want to continue to let it go on the way it is. So what they're starting to say is, hey, listen, not our circus, not our monkeys. You have the majority. You guys work this out and you pass this law. Don't dump it on us to try and save you the way that the Republicans had to do for the past 2 years. If you remember, Mike Johnson could never get a measure through his own party. He had to rely on Democrats to fund the government. And so the issue at stake here is that what Trump wants more than anything is a massive tax cut for the wealthy and corporations, because the 2017 tax cut runs out in 2025, and he wants to re-up that for the very wealthy and for billionaires. But that's estimated to cost like $4.3 trillion over the next 10 years, and the extreme MAGAs are like, no, you can't add more to the debt because this is what we're trying to get rid of. And that's where the calls for cutting Medicare and Medicaid and so on are coming from. But Trump doesn't want to cut those things because he recognizes how unpopular they would be. So what they're hoping to do is to force the Democrats to vote for the tax cuts in order to keep the government functioning. So the Democrats might very well say no. So when you hear that the Democrats are shutting down the government, that's that same language that is a lie. The idea that the Democrats are always blamed for everything and the Republicans are all the good guys. We got to stop that. And this is not about partisanship, by the way, although it's being expressed in partisan ways. We're literally talking about lies versus the truth. And one of the things that I think I'm going to write for President's Day, I haven't decided yet, but it astonishes me that we are in a period when the Republicans are simply lying to people. And it's been going on for a while now, but I still see this every day in my inbox. People send me things and they say, oh my God, is this true? And the answer is always no. They are lying to you. And you can see this above all in the fact that Donald Trump insisted he had nothing to do with Project 2025. He didn't know what it was. It was going to have nothing to do with his presidency. And now, I think it's 3/4 of the executive orders he has written have come straight from Project 2025. He has made the ringleaders of Project 2025 central to his administration and so on. And nobody is sort of looking at him and going, you lied to us. We're never going to believe another thing you said. Instead, they're sitting here going, oh, well, we kind of expected it. Or Pam Bondi, who insisted she would not use the Department of Justice in order to get revenge on enemies. The minute she's confirmed, she drops 14 orders that use the Department of Justice as revenge on Trump's enemies. And this idea that we are going to continue to pretend that their lies should be taken at any kind of face value kind of makes me crazy, because I don't know where it comes from. I don't know why it's suddenly okay for a president to look at you and simply lie to your face and have people go, yeah, but he's my guy. I don't know why people would do that. So looking at where we are, when you hear things like that, and it is important to understand them for sure, but your first assumption at this point ought to be that MAGA Republicans are lying to you, because that's what they do, and that the Democrats are telling you the truth. Now, you can look into those things and see whether or not it's true, but every study will tell you that the people who lie are the reactionary right wing. And I'm not talking about the centrists, and I'm not talking about the liberals, and this is, once again, to be clear, the vast majority of Americans, whether they vote Republican or Democrat, are liberals. That is, they believe the government has a role to play in all the things that I just articulated: equality before the law, right to a say in your government, and equal access to resources. People on the far right disagree with that and want to destroy American democracy, liberal democracy, in order to put in place a dictator. Those are the people who are currently destroying our country. The far left also disagrees with the concepts of liberal democracy, because they believe it has been so tainted by race, class, and gender that it can never actually allow people equality. And so they also think it should be torn down. But they're not in power here at all, for all that Trump keeps screaming about people like me being Marxists. That's not even vaguely true. The vast majority of us believe in the kind of government that they are dismantling, and we sure as heck better stand up and stand against that. All right, so where am I going to leave you with this? Because what I'm suggesting here is not just piecemeal pushback. And it's not just call your Congress critters every day, repeatedly. As you know, we're shutting the switchboards down. There's so many calls. It's not only flooding social media. It's not only participating in Indivisible, Red, Wine, and Blue, the card campaign, all the different places that you can push back. It is not only getting involved at the local level, both at your town government and your state government, and working, for example, in the Florida special election coming up I'm not going to give you the date because I don't remember it off the top of my head, fighting in North Carolina to make sure that Allison Riggs does in fact get seated, although the Republican is trying to steal that seat, trying to get the election in Wisconsin, the Supreme Court election, to go to somebody who will not defend gerrymandering. It's not just all of those things, all of which are very important. It's not just showing up in person for the protests that are beginning to happen. It's also personal, I guess, is the way to put it. It's stop letting them run your brain. Stop letting them say to you, I'm just cutting waste, because they're lying to you. There's been no proof of that. Stop letting them determine the parameters under which we operate the United States of America, because we have done this since the 1980s. Those of us who care about the government, who care about principles of democracy, who care about taking care of the community in this country, have been on the back foot, have been defending, well, okay, maybe there's waste here, and maybe we should cut this. And maybe no. We've done that for 40 years, and it's gotten us to the point where we first had a coup run with people trying to overturn an election, and now we've got it run by people who are wearing suits and ties or T-shirts or whatever the doggy guys are wearing. But this is our country, and we get to define it, and we should define it, and stop accepting the terms that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are handing to us, not least because Donald Trump is deep in dementia, and Musk seems deeply, deeply disturbed. There are 332 million of us who don't think the way that Musk and Trump do, and who would like to protect our democracy, whether or not people voted Republican or Democrat in the last election. So I guess when I'm thinking about how to approach this moment, which is so frightening in so many ways, and believe me, I get it. I mean, I really get it. And it's coming at you so fast, you don't know what to do, and you keep thinking everything is going to hell in a handbasket. Our democracy is not lost. It really is not. And you know how I know that? Because I can do this. You know, I couldn't have done this in Assad's Syria. I couldn't do this in many countries that are run by a dictator. But we could get there, and we could get there quickly. But we still have the power to define ourselves, the way we think about our society, and we have the power still to define our government. Because when Trump and Musk lose the ability to say that they have we the people behind them, this is why they keep talking about a mandate, which they did not have. More people voted for somebody other than Donald Trump than voted for him, and his popularity and Musk's both are plunging. That's why they keep talking about a mandate, is because they want to be able to say they have the mandate to do this. They do not have the mandate to do this. And to the degree we can take that away from them, say, no, we did not sign up for 19 to 24-year-olds to have access to our personal information, including our bank accounts and our social security numbers, biggest breach in human history of data. We did not sign up for this tech guy to decide he was going to run our lives by AI and to get control over the United States financial system. The degree to which we take that back and say, no, this is not our country, and we support each other in the things that we do care about, weather, climate change, gun violence, education, cancer research. That's when we change the way people think about this country. And right now, for all as scary as it is, for the first time in a long time, people who kept saying that they wouldn't, they would never take away Social Security, would never take away food support, would never take any of these things, are really having to grapple with the fact that's exactly what is happening. And now is the time to say, we don't want to turn this country over to an oligarchy. We don't want to turn this country over to a dictator. We don't want to turn this country over to a strongman. We want the United States of America to be, for American citizens, what it has been since the 1930s, and to insist upon taking that back. I don't really have a lot more to say to you, because again, it's just everything is such a ping pong ball right now. You can read me at night, of course, as you know. I don't know, people apparently didn't know I also read the letters as a podcast. Everything I do is free. But it's going to be a bad week. And people are going to be hurt. And it's important to empathize with them. It's also really important to call out what a very few people, including an unelected tech bro, is doing to millions of human beings around the world, but certainly to people here at home, and to insist that this is not the government we want, and to make damn sure your congresspeople, your state representatives, your local representatives, your friends, everybody hears that. Because if we don't protect the United States of America now, we may not have the ability to do that pretty quickly. Thank you for being here, and I will see you tonight. I will remind you that tomorrow is the anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth, Charles Darwin's birth, born on the same day, which I think is really, really interesting, and the birth of the NAACP, which is also interesting. So I hope you all raise a glass to all of those things. All right. Thank you for being here. I will see you. I'm going to fit another one of these in, I think, before next Tuesday. Thank you for being here.